I always thought hospitals were supposed to be places of healing, places where one could find solace and comfort in the midst of illness or injury. But the night I spent in Ward 13 changed everything I ever believed about hospitals and the darkness that lurks within them. It started like any other ordinary evening. I had been working late at the office and wasn't feeling well, so I decided to stop by the hospital on my way home. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as I made my way through the empty corridors, the echo of my footsteps the only sound piercing the silence. As I approached Ward 13, a chill ran down my spine, sending shivers cascading through my body. I shook it off, attributing it to my feverish state, and pushed open the heavy door. The air inside was thick with the scent of antiseptic, mingled with something far more sinister that I couldn't quite place. I found an empty bed and settled in, hoping to get some rest before heading home. But sleep eluded me, as the shadows danced along the walls, taking on eerie shapes that seemed to taunt and tease me. Then I heard it, a soft, melodic humming drifting through the darkness. At first I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but as the sound grew louder, I realized it was coming from the far end of the ward. Curiosity getting the better of me, I rose from my bed and followed the sound, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. As I drew closer, the humming turned into a haunting melody, sending chills down my spine. I rounded the corner and froze in terror at the sight before me, a figure cloaked in white, her face obscured by a surgical mask, her eyes burning with an otherworldly intensity. She moved with an unnatural grace, gliding across the floor as if she were weightless. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips as she drew nearer, her gaze never wavering from mine. It was then that I noticed the blood staining her uniform, dripping from her hands in thick, crimson droplets that pooled at her feet. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet as I scrambled to escape. But no matter how fast I ran, she was always there, her presence looming over me like a dark cloud. I finally reached the door, flinging it open and fleeing into the safety of the corridor. But even then, I could feel her presence lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment when she would strike. I stumbled through the hospital, my heart pounding in my chest as I searched for help. But every room I entered was empty, the corridors stretching out before me like a never-ending maze. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard the sound of footsteps echoing behind me. I turned around, expecting to see the horror nurse looming over me once again. But instead I was greeted by the sight of a lone figure, a man cloaked in darkness, his eyes burning with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. He reached out to me, his hand extended in a silent invitation. And in that moment I knew that I was no longer alone, that the horrors of Ward 13 were far from over. Together we vanished into the darkness, our fates intertwined in a nightmare from which there was no escape. And as the hospital faded into the distance behind us, I couldn't help but wonder what other horrors awaited us in the darkness beyond. The heavy wind outside the hospital windows sounded like a chorus of tormented souls, each gust carrying with it a haunting melody that seemed to seep into the very walls of the building. I sat alone in the dimly lit corridor, my heart pounding against my ribcage like a trapped animal desperate for escape. It was the dead of night, and the only company I had was the eerie symphony of the wind and the echoing footsteps of my own fears. I was the night nurse on duty, tasked with keeping watch over the silent halls of St. Agnes Hospital. It was a job I had grown accustomed to, but tonight was different. Tonight, there was a darkness lurking in the shadows, a malevolent presence that sent shivers down my spine with every creak of the floorboards. As I made my rounds, checking on the few patients scattered throughout the ward, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and a chill ran down my spine as I reached the end of the corridor. That's when I saw him, the alone man. He stood at the far end of the hallway, bathed in the sickly glow of the flickering lights above. His figure was obscured by the darkness, but I could see the glint of something metallic in his hand. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what he was doing. He was hammering his patient. With a sickening thud, the hammer came down again and again, each blow accompanied by a gut-wrenching scream that echoed through the empty halls. I wanted to run, to hide, to escape the horrors unfolding before me, but my feet were rooted to the spot as if held in place by some unseen force. I watched in horror as the alone man continued his grisly work, his face contorted in a mask of madness as he unleashed his fury upon the helpless victim lying before him. The sound of bones splintering and flesh tearing filled the air, drowning out the howling wind and sending bile rising in my throat. I knew I had to do something, to stop this madness before it was too late, but fear held me in its grip like a vice. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to save myself from the horrors unfolding before me, but I couldn't abandon the poor soul at the mercy of the alone man's twisted rage. Summoning every ounce of courage I possessed, I forced my trembling legs to carry me forward, step by agonizing step, until I stood mere feet away from the scene of carnage. The alone man didn't seem to notice my presence, lost in his frenzied assault as he rained blow after blow upon his victim. With a shaky hand, I reached out and grabbed his shoulder, spinning him around to face me. His eyes burned with a madness beyond comprehension, and a wicked grin twisted his lips as he stared into my soul. In that moment I knew that I was not dealing with a mere mortal man, but something far more sinister. Before I could react, he lashed out with the hammer, swinging it towards me with deadly intent. I barely managed to dodge out of the way, the metal head whistling past my ear with a hair-raising sound. Adrenaline surged through my veins as I stumbled backwards, desperation lending wings to my feet as I fled down the corridor, the echoes of the alone man's laughter ringing in my ears. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of the hospital's entrance, where I collapsed to the ground in a trembling heap. The night air was cold against my sweat-soaked skin, but it was nothing compared to the icy grip of fear that still clung to me like a shadow. As dawn broke on the horizon, casting long shadows across the deserted streets, I knew that I would never be able to forget the horrors I had witnessed in the dark heart of the hospital. The alone man still roamed the halls, his sinister laughter echoing through the empty corridors, a reminder that some nightmares never truly end. And though I may have escaped with my life, I knew that a part of me would always remain trapped in the darkness, haunted by the memory of that fateful night. The sterile, antiseptic smell of the hospital was suffocating. It lingered in every corner, creeping into my nostrils with each shallow breath I took. I sat alone in the dimly lit waiting room, the only sound the distant hum of machinery and the occasional shuffle of nurses' footsteps. My heart pounded against my chest like a prisoner desperate to escape its confines. I glanced at the clock on the wall, its hands ticking away the minutes until my fate would be decided. My name is Daniel, and I never thought I would find myself in a place like this. But life has a cruel way of twisting our paths, leading us down dark corridors we never imagined we'd traverse. It all began with a routine checkup, a nagging pain in my chest that refused to go away. I thought nothing of it at first, chalking it up to stress or indigestion. But when the pain persisted, gnawing at me like a hungry beast, I knew I had to seek help. The doctors were vague in their explanations, their faces masked in professional neutrality as they poked and prodded, running tests and scribbling notes on their clipboards. They spoke in hushed tones, their words like cryptic whispers that sent shivers down my spine. And then came the diagnosis, delivered with all the solemnity of a death sentence. a rare heart condition that required immediate surgery. I was ushered into the operating room with all the ceremony of a sacrificial lamb. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like angry wasps, casting eerie shadows on the tiled floor. I lay on the cold metal table, my body tense with fear as masked figures bustled around me, their voices muffled by layers of fabric. And then, the anesthesia took hold, dragging me into the depths of unconsciousness with its icy grip. When I awoke, it was to a world of pain and confusion. My chest throbbed with a dull ache, and the room spun in dizzying circles as I struggled to orient myself. I tried to speak, to ask for help, but my voice came out as a hoarse whisper, lost in the oppressive silence of the room. Panic clawed at my throat as I realized I was alone, abandoned in this sterile prison with no one to hear my cries. I staggered to my feet, my limbs heavy with exhaustion as I stumbled towards the door. But when I reached for the handle, it refused to budge, mocking me with its stubborn refusal. I pounded on the metal with all the strength I could muster, but it might as well have been a solid wall for all the good it did me. Time lost all meaning in that place, stretching and contorting like a warped reflection in a funhouse mirror. I wandered the empty corridors like a ghost, my footsteps echoing off the walls in a hollow cadence. Shadows danced in the corners of my vision, twisting and writhing like malevolent spirits waiting to pounce. And then I saw him. The phantom surgeon, they called him, a spectral figure shrouded in darkness. He drifted through the halls like a wraith, his footsteps silent as the grave. His eyes burned with an otherworldly light, piercing through the darkness with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to run, to escape the clutches of this unholy apparition, but my legs refused to obey me. It was as if I were rooted to the spot, a helpless spectator in my own nightmare. The phantom surgeon drew closer, his presence filling the air with a palpable sense of dread. And then he spoke. His voice was like the rustle of dead leaves, dry and brittle against the silence of the night. He whispered words of unspeakable horror, promises of pain and suffering beyond imagining. I wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but my voice died in my throat, choked off by the overwhelming terror that consumed me. I closed my eyes, praying for it to end, but when I opened them again, I was still there, trapped in this nightmarish purgatory with no hope of escape. The phantom surgeon loomed over me, his shadowy form blotting out the feeble light like a harbinger of doom. And then I felt it. The cold touch of his hand against my chest, icy fingers probing and prodding with a clinical detachment that chilled me to the bone. I wanted to recoil, to fight back against this violation of my very being, but I was powerless against his unearthly strength. And then, mercifully, the darkness claimed me, dragging me down into its comforting embrace. I welcomed its embrace, its oblivion a blessed relief from the horrors that had haunted me. And as I slipped away into unconsciousness, I prayed that I would never again awaken to the nightmare that had become my reality. But the darkness was not to be my sanctuary for long. When I opened my eyes again, I found myself back in that sterile room, my body battered and broken but somehow still alive. The doctors bustled around me, their faces masks of concern as they muttered words I could not comprehend. I tried to tell them of the horrors I had witnessed, of the phantom surgeon who stalked the halls like a vengeful spirit, but they only exchanged worried glances and shook their heads in disbelief. They chalked it up to delirium, a side effect of the anesthesia, and dismissed my ravings as the product of a fevered imagination. But I know the truth. I know what I saw in those shadowy corridors, what whispered secrets echoed in the darkness. And though I may never be able to prove the reality of my ordeal, the memory will haunt me until the end of my days. For I am the alone man in the hospital, and the phantom surgeon is a nightmare that will never let me rest. I never quite understood why I chose to work the night shift at St. Mary's Hospital. Perhaps it was the allure of solitude, the quiet hours when the world seemed to stand still. Or maybe it was the challenge, the thrill of navigating the empty corridors haunted by the whispers of the past. Whatever the reason, I found myself alone in the hospital, surrounded by darkness and the eerie silence that only nightfall could bring. As the clock struck midnight, I settled into my routine, checking the empty rooms and ensuring everything was in order. The hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed to echo through the halls, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. There was a certain comfort in the routine, a sense of familiarity that eased the tension of the night. But as the hours wore on, that comfort began to fade, replaced by a growing unease that lingered in the air like a thick fog. The hospital seemed to come alive with a presence I couldn't quite define, a feeling of being watched from the shadows. I tried to shake off the feeling, chalking it up to exhaustion and the overactive imagination of a tired mind. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the sensation only grew stronger, creeping into every corner of my consciousness until I could no longer deny its existence. With a sense of dread creeping over me, I made my rounds with a newfound urgency, eager to escape the suffocating grip of the darkness that threatened to consume me. But no matter how fast I walked, the corridors stretched out endlessly before me, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I reached the end of one hallway, I heard a faint sound echoing from somewhere deep within the bowels of the hospital. It was a soft, plaintive wail that sent shivers down my spine, raising the hairs on the back of my neck. Heart pounding, I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing loudly in the empty corridor. With each step, the wail grew louder, until it filled the air like a deafening roar, drowning out the sound of my own thoughts. Finally, I reached the source of the sound, a dimly lit room at the far end of the hall. As I pushed open the door, my heart sank at the sight that greeted me. Lying on the bed was a figure shrouded in darkness, their features obscured by the shadows that clung to them like a cloak. But even in the dim light, I could see the agony etched into their face, the silent scream that twisted their features into a grotesque mask of pain. With trembling hands, I reached out to touch them, my fingers brushing against their icy skin. But as my hand made contact, the figure dissolved into smoke, vanishing before my eyes like a specter in the night. I stumbled back in shock, my mind reeling from the encounter. What had I just witnessed? Was it a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination? Or had I stumbled upon something far more sinister lurking within the walls of the hospital? Unable to shake the feeling of dread that clung to me like a second skin, I fled from the room, desperate to escape the suffocating darkness that threatened to consume me. But no matter how fast I ran, the shadows seemed to follow, reaching out with icy fingers that clawed at my sanity. As I rounded a corner, I collided with something solid, sending me sprawling to the ground with a cry of pain. Blinking back tears, I looked up to see a figure standing before me, their features obscured by the darkness that surrounded them. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely more than a terrified whimper. But the figure said nothing, their gaze fixed on me with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. With a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, I realized that I was not alone in the hospital, that something far more sinister lurked in the shadows, waiting to claim its next victim. With a desperate cry, I scrambled to my feet and fled into the darkness, the echoes of my footsteps drowned out by the pounding of my own heart. But no matter how fast I ran, I could feel the presence of the figure following close behind, its icy breath hot on my neck. And as I stumbled out into the night, I knew that I would never be free from the darkness that lurked within the walls of St. Mary's Hospital, that the horror I had witnessed would haunt me for the rest of my days. I never imagined that a simple visit to the hospital could plunge me into the depths of terror and despair. It started innocently enough. My friend, Ethan, had been admitted for a minor surgery, and being the good friend that I am, I decided to pay him a visit. Little did I know that this visit would lead me to confront horrors beyond my wildest nightmares. As I entered the hospital, though the air was warm and sterile, the fluorescent lights flickered ominously overhead, casting long shadows that danced along the sterile white walls. The scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, mingling with the faint odor of illness and despair. Navigating the labyrinthine corridors, I finally arrived at Ethan's room, only to find it empty. Confused, I approached the nurse's station to inquire about his whereabouts. The nurse, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, informed me that Ethan had been moved to room 13 on the 13th floor for post-operative care. A shiver ran down my spine at the mention of room 13. Superstition and urban legends flooded my mind, but I brushed them aside, attributing my unease to mere paranoia. With a forced smile, I thanked the nurse and made my way to the elevator. The ride to the 13th floor felt interminable, each floor passing in agonizing slowness. When the doors finally opened, I stepped out into a dimly lit hallway that seemed to stretch into infinity. The walls were a sickly shade of green, and the air was thick with an oppressive heaviness that seemed to press down on my chest. Room 13 was tucked away at the far end of the corridor, its door looming ominously in the dim light. Steeling myself, I approached and hesitated before knocking softly. There was no response, only an eerie silence that seemed to swallow the sound of my heartbeat. Summoning my courage, I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room was bathed in darkness, the only light emanating from the soft glow of the moon filtering in through the window. Ethan lay in the bed, his form barely discernible in the shadows. "Hey, Ethan," I said, my voice quavering slightly. "It's me, your friend. How are you feeling?" No response. I took a hesitant step forward, my eyes straining to pierce the darkness. That's when I noticed something peculiar about the room. It was devoid of the usual hospital equipment. No force stands, no heart rate monitors, nothing. "Ethan?" I called again, my voice tinged with growing unease. "Are you there?" Suddenly, a chill swept through the room, sending goosebumps racing across my skin. I could feel eyes watching me from the shadows, unseen and malevolent. And then, a voice whispered from the darkness, a voice that sent shivers down my spine and froze the blood in my veins. "Leave this place," it hissed, a sinister undertone lacing its words. "Leave, before it's too late." I stumbled backward, my gaze darting wildly around the room. But there was no one there, only the oppressive darkness and the feeling of impending doom that hung heavy in the air. With trembling hands I fumbled for the door, my mind reeling with fear and confusion. As I stepped back into the hallway, I felt a sense of relief wash over me, a brief respite from the horrors that lurked within room 13. But my relief was short-lived. As I turned to leave, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the corridor, piercing the silence like a knife. It was Ethan's voice, filled with unimaginable agony and terror. Driven by instinct, I raced back to room 13, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I burst through the door, the room was empty. Ethan was gone, leaving behind only a lingering sense of dread and despair. Frantic, I searched every corner of the room, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only echoes of his torment. In a panic, I fled the hospital, my mind consumed by fear and confusion. But no matter how far I ran, I could not escape the memory of that night. The night I ventured into room 13 and came face to face with the horrors that lurked within its shadowy depths. To this day, I cannot shake the feeling that something sinister resides within that room, something ancient and malevolent, waiting to ensnare unsuspecting souls in its web of darkness. And as I lie awake at night, haunted by nightmares of that fateful encounter, I can't help but wonder what truly lies behind the door of room 13, and will its secrets ever be revealed?